primarily what we do is we make and sell lime mortars. That's the primary thing that we do. And we've been doing it for quite a long time. So we've seen lots of different options for people who are restoring an old building in terms of lime. Over the years, we've seen lots of different things come and some of them go. And so we have a collection of lime mortars and plasters that are used for rebuilding walls, for pointing walls, for fixing stone, for fixing brick, for plastering walls internally, for externally rendering walls, for being used as lime washes, grouting, pouring liquid grouts into the centre of walls. Again, all to do with the repair of solid stone structures and solid brick structures. We also have, over the years, you start with your base product, but then the same person needs some tools. So you need to actually have the right tools available. They need some equipment like, for example, hessian and lats and bits and pieces that are needed as on site to actually protect their work. And then further on from that, then they need to decorate. So you've got paints and other decoration materials that come into the equation. So it's primarily about the wet trades, supplying to the wet trades, plasterers, masons, bricklayers, painters. They're the people that buy our materials. But then you'll also have people, architects who specify our materials, so that's people that we speak with, and of course homeowners who actually live with the materials. So they want to choose their own thing. They want to make sure that the right material is used and it's not left just with the hands of the trades to decide. 95% of the projects we do are actually fairly small, fairly modest. It would be somebody who's bought a property, might be a cottage, maybe a townhouse, and has dampness issues, and they want to actually strip off the cement render, which traps the moisture, and put on something like a lime plaster. There's a fairly substantial amount of our customers are that type of person. And then we have the larger projects. We have large projects like town walls, churches, cathedrals. Like locally here in Cork, we would have been involved in St Finbarr's Cathedral, Cloyne Cathedral, Cove Cathedral, Youghal, St Mary's, the parish, both the parish church. No, we would have been involved in nearly all of the local projects. And then you have sizable houses as well, like Photo House, for example, which we would have actually been heavily involved with when that was restored. Belvelly Castle was done recently in East Cork. But I do have stockists around the country as well. So we have a good presence in Dublin. We have a very good presence in Northern Ireland, down the west coast, where actually it's growing there. And we've very strong pockets of business in places like Tipperary, the Golden Vale, where there's lots of large houses. Tipperary, Limerick, some parts of Waterford, the Blackwater Valley. So we have fairly extensive. We have fairly sizable jobs sometimes, and sometimes very interesting. Like we've analysed mortars from everything from the Rock of Cashel right through to ballast on some of the ships in the Spanish Armada. Well, there's always a challenge with moisture management. So we live in a very damp climate and it's getting damper, more wet. And we have to manage the moisture and the water content in the walls. Because, as I said, everybody who's grown up in an old building often has kind of connects it to dampness, connects it to coldness. And these walls, which are built from stone and have an external leaf of stone, an internal leaf of stone, and a rubble core in the middle, the solid walls allow moisture to pass through fairly easily if you have certain materials on the outside. But if you have a material on the outside that acts like a Gore-Tex sheet, which stops liquid water getting through, but then still allows water vapour to evaporate out of the wall when the sun comes out, then you can have a very dry wall. And then the mass of the wall, which is full of air then at that stage rather than moisture, acts as an insulator as well, and it keeps the heat in the structure. And there is a clear difference between water vapour permeability, which is breathability, and liquid water penetration. So while a wall will have certain resistance to liquid water penetration, and liquid water penetration is basically rain, or possibly rising damp, or possibly sometimes a leaking gutter, and that's where liquid water gets into the structure. So we want to try and reduce the amount of liquid water getting in. But water then doesn't drip back out again. It drips in, but it doesn't drip back out again. It needs to convert to a gas. It needs to convert to water vapor to evaporate into the atmosphere. And therefore, we actually need to allow the outside leaf of the walls to stop the liquid water getting in or reduce the liquid water getting in. But then when the sun comes out, allow the water vapor to evaporate out. We still have lime that is very compatible with what was there previously. And some of the mortars that were used in the past would have actually just been taken local sand, local lime, mixed them together, maybe with one or two other ingredients, and you have your basic mortar. Now we can do that, but we can also use technology to test the mortar and see what's in it and how has it degraded over time. How has it changed? Is the lime binder, which is soluble in water, has it been washed out over time? Is the building in a ruin? And also we test it for its functionality. So how is it working? Is it performing? Is it stopping moisture getting in, liquid water getting in, and is it allowing water to evaporate back out? So we can adjust then whatever needs to be done. So it wouldn't necessarily always be matching like for like, because what we take out may not be working. We may need to put something else in that is working. But what we would do is we would try as much as possible to use the conservation principles, which would be doing as little harm as possible, disturbing as little as possible, making sure that as much as possible that we can actually replicate what was in there before. For our business, for Stoneware Studios, we would find that the regulations that were put in place in the 1980s to list buildings, to actually protect buildings, suit us. Up to then, what was happening was that if there was a building that wasn't in any way of value to the developer who had bought it, it would be flattened. Okay, and then maybe some of the materials would have been reclaimed and reused, like the brick might have been reclaimed, but more often than not went into landfill and rubble. So those laws and those the listing of buildings, the setting up of conservation officer departments in each of the county councils, that's actually been very, very beneficial for the old buildings in general. And then we sit into that. So the materials we supply are traditional materials. They're compatible with the types of materials that were originally used. So as a consequence, really, those laws actually are beneficial to Stoneware Studios. I spend a lot of time on building sites. So we do most of our training outside of Pilmore, outside of Stoneware Studios. And that would be trade training. So that would be people plasterers, masons, who may know plenty about plastering and masonry, but they may not know a whole lot about lime. So what I would do, and my colleagues, what we would do is we'd actually go and we'd show them what we're going to use. So we're going to explain maybe the sand, what type of sand we would use, making sure that it's appropriately sized for the technique that they're. So if they were plastering a wall, maybe it'd be different than if they were building a wall, different type of sand. We have to make sure that that sand was really clean, sharp, well graded, that you can see that it's going to work and there's going to be very little shrinkage. It's also important that all the materials that we supply are workable. In other words, that they're easy to use, because you don't want to supply material to a building site which might seem like, in theory, a good idea, but then they don't want to use it. And the plasterers or masons get tired of this material that's really hard to use, and then they start cutting corners. So supply the sand, we explain the sand selection, and then the choice of lime. And there's quite a wide variety of choices of lime. We stock products from Cecil and Round Tower, which are imported limes and naturally hydraulic limes. And then we use a local lime putty, and we also supply quicklime mortars. So we supply quicklime for the making of hot lime mortars. For example, we might have a mortar that will be used in the quay walls in Youghal, and it needs to go hard before the tide comes in. So it needs to go hard in 2 hours. We might have another mortar that's going to be used on latten plaster in an old building, an old ceiling, let's say, and that may be a setting time of a week, 10 days, that type of time frame. So we go to site, explain that, and find that once the plasterer or mason or bricklayer understands what they're using, they get a better feel for how they're doing the work. Then they understand how it sets, how it's cured, and they understand that you need moisture present in the mortar for it to go hard, but also you need a certain amount of air and carbon dioxide within the air for the carbonation process to take place. In Pilmore here, we bring in people, do a general lime day, and it's always mixed with some architects and interior designers, engineers occasionally, and those would actually be specifying our products, so they want to understand what they're all about. There will be a share of homeowners who've either inherited a property or bought a property or have been living in a property for a long time, and they want to do a share of work. They want to get something done. It might be insulating the old building, it might be just plastering, it might be decorating the old building, and they want to spend the day thinking about it. You know, it's good sometimes to go off and do a day's course and immerse yourself in the concepts, talk to like-minded people during that day, and they'll find that you come away then with ideas and you can make decisions. And then the last type of person that would come into these courses would be actually the trades themselves. So some people actually come, and those guys who are on site, and they want to come in and they want to learn about lime and they want to understand it, so that they can go to their next job and they can say, well, I'm going to choose an NHL 2 here or an NHL 3.5 here, and this is the reason why. And they can talk to their clients kind of with a certain amount of education about the materials that they're using. The lime is very important, and the water content is very important to control shrinkage and make sure the set takes place. But one of the parts of the ingredients that is as important as anything else is the sand content. So we would always try and use as local a sand as possible, but there's not so many sands available now that are following the criteria that we would want, which is firstly that it's nice and sharp and that it's clean and that it's well graded. So you can see, for example, we've got two sands here, one of them being beach sand. Now, it comes from a beach that is no longer a beach, that's been washed completely. It's 2 or 3 miles inland and it's been washed completely of its salt. And salt's very soluble as well, so it's easy to wash out. But it's a beach sand, so it's been cleaned twice a day during the life of the sand, twice a day with the tide. So there's no mud in it, there's no clay in it. And clay and mud in lime mortars can cause shrinkage and cracking. And if you've cracks in an old building, you could end up with moisture and water getting in. So you've got this type of sand here. And just to give you an idea as to the grading of it, and you see this around the country, and in fact what it is not a natural sand. It doesn't come from a glacial till or from a pit, it actually comes from crushed stone. So there's a tendency when you buy sand that is from a crushed stone quarry, is that you get a lot of clay as well, a lot of mud, and it does affect the performance of the mortar. So you can see in comparison, but also you often get very fine sands, and you'll see that there's very little in the way of pebble, and this kind of quantity of pebble, which is nice and rounded and looks very well when it's exposed in the mortar over time. There's very little of it in crushed stone, so we try and avoid that type of mortar. You can see it's one colour, so it's kind of purpley grey colour, very typical of old red sandstone. So this is the type of sand that you can get locally in most places, but you'll find actually there's a lot more of the clay content in this than in the wash sand from Wexford. So we tend to use the wash sand from Wexford more often than not. If you can, even here, you can see there's about 3 times the quantity of clay in the mix. So that's actually important. Over 4 or 5% of clay in a lime mortar, you're going to end up with shrinkage. And you can add hair or fibres or any other type of armature in for reinforcement, but you'll still have issues when the sun comes out and the sun hits the wall and it dries out fast. You're going to have issues with controlling shrinkage if you've got clay in the mortar. So that's something that's important to note. As well as that, we will also, when you come to train in Stoneware Studios, we'll go through the different types of sands and different types of limes, different types of additives, the pozzolans, all the various materials that you can add in to improve the performance of a lime mortar. But we'll also check and see what type of sand. You bring your sand along and you bring your mortar along, and we'll assess it and see what type of ingredients we need to put into the mix to replicate what you've had before. and we will assess the sand that you have locally, see if it's up to scratch, so test it, make sure it's good enough, and then we'll be able to actually do a little test, checking the void structure and make sure that we have enough lime in the mix to make sure that all the sand particles are bound properly together. I think lime has a very long history. It may actually, for a lot of people, it'll just become more standard. People will be, while it was a mystery for a long time and it was always a specialist product, I think it'll just become more mainstream. So where it'll be available, there'll be a selection of limes available in all hardware shops, not just one. And that you won't have to add cement to lime to make it work. You may be able to have a lime there that will work in the same way, it'll set in the same way, but will give you that flexibility and breathability that you're looking for when you use lime. Obviously, with the climate changes, we definitely need to consider insulating old buildings and using less fuel and using less oil. So there's going to be more and more insulation options. There has been an increasing amount of insulation products over the last couple of years. Some of them have kind of been overselling themselves maybe a little bit, and you're guaranteed, for large money, you're guaranteed a certain amount of performance. And sometimes those performance figures and the criteria that they use are based in laboratories, and they're not really based on real life in Ireland, where it can rain continually for days and days and days. So, if you actually have a material, like for example, hemp, for example, which is a really good insulator in all ways, but it also acts like a sponge. So if something acts like a sponge and it gets wet, the insulation value is down. While something like cork, for example, if you choose one over the other, cork has the opposite cell structure. So cork won't allow water into the cell. Cork has been used for wine bottles for many years, and it's used for fishing floats and in refrigeration. So if you choose the right material as an insulator in combination with lime, then you have every chance to reduce your fuel bills. Another part of the future which we're encountering over the last 5 or 6 years is just making actually life a bit easier to use lime. So using machinery, using technology, sometimes using additives. Now, not chemical additives that have petrochemical background, but certain additives that will help for performance. So it might make it, for example, you might be by adding in some cellulose into a lime mortar, you'll be able to then pass it through a machine that you can spray the lime on, which halves the time of application, halves the cost of application sometimes. So you have technology, machinery that can be used, and traditionally wasn't used, but it's becoming more and more so now. So what you have is colour that, I think there's natural colours as well that come from nature, that come from siennas and ochres and umbers that come from the ground, they're clays. And it just feels more natural that these colours give a vibrancy to old buildings. They reflect light differently, okay, because they don't have this flat, they have little, particularly if you use lime, which the calcite crystals of lime have a number of sides to them, so they reflect light kind of in jewels, so you get twice as much light back. If you ever stand in front of a lime washed cottage, it's glaringly white, much whiter than brilliant white from one of the paint suppliers. It's glaringly white. And then if you add pigments into them that are natural, it's soft, and it just has a feel to it. I think we go away on holidays, we go to Italy and Greece and so on, and we see these Tunisia and Mediterranean, and we see the light and the colour, and we come home then and we say, geez, why don't we like that? But that's what it's about. It's about colour and light. If you're involved in the industry and you're involved in building conservation, you appreciate the time and effort, the little extra time and effort that's needed to use lime, for example. You appreciate that, and you actually then say, okay, you drive by every day and you say, okay, well, I'm happy that I was involved there. It's nice to be able to be involved in an industry that values aesthetic qualities of the end result of the materials that we supply. I think it's down to like beauty, and it's down to attractiveness. Something that something catches your eye, and it can be a colour or a combination of colour and texture, and it just seems to hold with you. And our sound's different, smells different. It's unusual, but if you really get into old buildings, you get a feel for the sound of them. You get a feel for how the size and dimensions of a structure can actually make you feel inside. And then I work with people who are, you know, very loyal, and I'm very loyal to them. They're very loyal to me. We work, and they've been with me for a long time, and we work well together. But I keep it small. You know, it's a small business. I'm not interested so much in expanding and working kind of 80 hours a week. I just want it to be kind of try and do quality rather than quantity. I think the future is still very bright. There's plenty to do, plenty little diversification routes to take if we choose, plenty of options. That's where I want it.